Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm John M. Hawkins. You're listening to My Strategy, and we're coming to you live from the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. We're very happy to be here with you today and glad you can join us. My Strategy episodes are live on Saturdays at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. Today, we're going to be talking about practice makes perfect. In this episode, we're going to talk about how to approach practicing, how much we should practice. Perfect practice makes perfect. And we're going to learn tips and tricks to help maximize your practice time. Well, again, very happy to be with you here today. Saturday is a great day of the week to reflect, and it's a day that I choose to reflect on my strategy. But keep in mind that any day is a good day to start to assess your personal strategy. Now, My Strategy Show continues to grow. We're available on iHeart, iTunes, Player FM, YouTube, SoundCloud, Spreaker, and many more of the digital platforms. So you can go there and listen to past episodes. We're also available on YouTube in the video variety. So if you'd like to see a video of the show, you can see it there. You can find me on most social media platforms. My Twitter handle is @HawkinsJohn. Or you can go to my website at johnmhawkins.com. That's johnmhawkins.com. And just like anything in life, we need to have a strategy and a plan to help us reach our goals, because the best laid plans don't always work. And this week, I'm looking for stories on practice. Do you have any good examples, a tip or a trick that you would like to share with us? You can send an email to talk@johnmhawkins.com. That's talk@johnmhawkins.com. And those can be entered weekly into our giveaway. And you can win a prize package, which includes a copy of my latest book, Coach to Greatness, and a $25 Visa gift card. Today we're talking about practice makes perfect. We're going to be talking about a better way to practice. There's actually an article that I've got here from a Juilliard-trained performer who has his PhD in music, and he talks a little bit about how we can do perfect practice. Talks a little bit about his experiences, his lessons learned. Pretty interesting stuff. We're then going to talk about some of the things people do not understand about practice. Is practice an art? Is it not just about the practicing? What about scheduling? How long should we commit to practicing? Things like that. I'm going to talk a little bit about the problem with perfect practice, when perfect practice is bad. There are some risks when you practice too perfectly. We'll talk a little bit about those. And we're going to talk a little bit about tips to help you practice more effectively with respect to creating an atmosphere, warming up, having a goal, all the things that we try and strive to attain on a weekly basis in this show. And we'll talk a little bit about ways we can develop your strategy so that you can have perfect practice or mindful practice, whichever you choose. We got an article here by Noah Kajiyama. And Noah Kajiyama went to Juilliard, and he was a violinist at a very young age, and he spent over 23 years at the time he wrote this article practicing. And he says, while it may be true that there are no shortcuts to anywhere worth going, there certainly are ways of needlessly prolonging the journey. We often waste lots of time because nobody ever taught us the most efficient and effective way to practice. Whether it's learning how to code, improving your writing skill, or playing a musical instrument, practicing the right way can mean the difference between good and great. And as I thought about this week, I think there's so many things that I'm practicing personally. I practice a little bit of guitar. I practice golf. And every time I go out there, I wonder, am I practicing enough? Well, sometimes it's evident by my performance, either on the golf course or trying to pick up a guitar and play. But I think it's interesting to listen to what Noah has to say, because he actually has achieved that greatness that one would expect. He said, you probably heard the old joke, the tourist who asked the cab driver, how do I get to Carnegie Hall? Only to be told, practice, practice, practice. Noah says he began playing the violin at age 2, and for as long as he could remember, there was one question which haunts him every single day. Is he practicing enough? So he goes on to look at and see what a performer might say. So he went through and looked at books and interviews with great artists, looking for consensus on practice time that would ease his conscience. So he read an interview with Rubinstein in which it stated that nobody should have to practice more than 4 hours a day. He explained that if you needed that much time, you probably weren't doing it right. And then he goes on to research violinist Nathan Milstein, who once asked his teacher Leopold R. how many hours a day should he be practicing. R responded by saying, "Practice with your fingers, and you need all day. Practice with your mind, and you will do as much in 1.5 hours." Even Heifetz indicated that he never believed in practicing too much, and that excessive practice was just as bad as practicing too little. He claimed that he practiced no more than 3 hours per day on average. So that's what the performers that Noah has come across have said. He says, what do psychologists say? He says, when it comes to understanding expertise and expert performance, psychologist Dr. Erickson is perhaps the leading authority in his research for the basis for the 10,000-hour rule, which you may have heard of, which suggests that it requires at least 10 years or 10,000 hours of deliberate practice to achieve an expert level of performance in any given domain. And in the case of a musician, more like 15 to 25 years in order to attain an elite international level. He says those are pretty big numbers, so large that at first he missed the most important factor in the equation. Noah had forgotten about deliberate practice, which means that there's a specific type of practice that facilitates the attainment of an elite level of performance. And then there's the kind of practice that most of us are familiar with, which is the mindless practice. Mindless practice, he says, are a couple of different methods. There's the broken record method, where we just repeat the same thing over and over again. Autopilot, which is where we activate our autopilot systems and coast. Practice our sales pitch 3 times a day, play a round of golf, run through a piece from beginning to end. He said then there's the hybrid method, where there's a combined approach. For most part of his life, practicing meant playing through a piece until he heard something he didn't like, at which point he'd stop and repeat the passage over and over again. He said there's problems with these methods. Unfortunately, number one, those 3 methods that he just mentioned, number one, it's a waste of time. Because, for one, very little productive learning takes place when you practice this way. Number 2, it makes you less confident. In addition, practicing mindlessly lowers your confidence as part of you realizing you don't really know how to produce the results you're looking for. He says it's mind-numbingly dull. Practicing mindlessly is a chore. We've all had well-meaning parents and teachers tell us to go home and practice a certain number of times, but it's boring. So what does he say is the solution to that? Well, it aligns with practice makes perfect. We're going to be talking more about this in the show. But he says the alternative is deliberate practice. Deliberate or mindful practice is a systematic and highly structured activity that is, for lack of a better word, more scientific. Instead of mindless trial and error, it is active and thoughtful process of hypothesis testing where we relentlessly seek solutions to clearly defined problems. You're listening to My Strategy. I am your host, John M. Hawkins, coming to you live from the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. When we come back, we're going to talk about some of the fundamentals that people do not understand about practice. We'll be right back. Hello and welcome back, everyone. I'm John M. Hawkins. You're listening to My Strategy, and we're coming to you live from the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. Well, glad you're here today. And today we're talking about practice makes perfect. Right before the break, we learned a little bit about Noah, who is a musician. He studied at the Juilliard School, and he gave us some tips on ways that we can look at our practice differently. We're going to hear a little bit more from him later on in the show. Right now I want to talk about some fundamental things that people don't understand about practice. It's an art. It's not just about practicing. Schedule and practice go together. I've got an article here by Nicholas Cole. It's called 10 Fundamental Things People Don't Understand About Practice. Nicholas says that people that boast how many days they've gone without sleep in hopes of proving their dedication to their craft are missing the point. He says practice is an art. It's not a simple plug and chug of hours in and skill level out. And in order to actually make the time you spend practicing meaningful, you have to bring a heightened level of awareness. You have to know what to look for, what to fix, and ultimately how to enter your zone. So Nicholas gives us some tips on how we can do this. He says it's not just about practicing. Going through the motions isn't enough, just similar to what we heard about mindful practice. He says you've got to be present and aware while you practice and actively looking for all the things you still need to improve on. Number 2, your schedule and your practice times should go together. If you're practicing in the morning some days, evenings other days, and afternoons at random, you're not as effective as the person who practices at the same time every day. Your schedule needs to be based around your practice hours, not the other way around. And keep in mind that we're talking about practicing music, but there's things we all need to practice every day. It's your speeches, your presentations, driving a car. Everything in life needs some sort of practice if we want to be good at it. Consistency is the most important part. Number 3, Rome didn't get built in a day. You can't go 5 days without practicing and then try to pull a 12-hour marathon to make up for lost time. Practicing a little bit each day is far more efficient than day-long sprints. Number 4, he says the sweet spot for practice is 3 to 4 hours, reason being that the first hour is you're still warming up, and the last hour you're entering your burnout. So in reality, a 4-hour practice session is really only 2 hours of truly quality practice, which means it's exceedingly important that you are mentally present during those middle 2 hours, which can be hard to do if you're not passionate about something, and I think that's one of the things that we need to take into the equation. You have to have a passion for something to really dedicate the time. Number 5, he says, don't practice what you're good at. Competition inherently looks for weaknesses. If you're a master one of the things, but for a total newbie at another, then all someone has to do is target your weakness. Make it a point to practice what you're not good at so that you're more well-rounded. Now, I can tell you that this particular one is something that Noah, in our previous article, had an issue with. We'll talk a little bit about that later, but let's think about it. I mean, do we want to focus on our weaknesses? We know we need to cover those weaknesses, but do we practice them? That's what he's suggesting here. Number 6, reflect after each practice session. Ask yourself, what did you improve upon today? Did you learn something new? Did you challenge yourself? What can you work on next? You want to be consistently asking yourself questions so that you know what to improve on next. It's not about getting it done. It's about getting it done right. If you're the type of person who times how long you've been practicing, you're already starting off on the wrong foot. It's not about practicing for the sake of practicing. You have to have a vision, something you're working towards. Then it no longer becomes about time. It becomes about the skill. Number 8, and this is a good one, study yourself. The ability to watch and learn from yourself is also extremely undervalued. If you're an athlete, record yourself playing your game. If you're a gamer, record your screen as you play. If you're a ghostwriter, go back through your work with a pen and look for improvement areas. If you're a musician, record yourself and listen to yourself play. This is so important. You can have a coach, somebody who's giving you feedback, but what you think you're doing in your head and what you really are doing are two very different things. And this is one way to do it. Record yourself. Go back and watch what you are doing. If you're practicing a sport, record yourself shooting the shots. Record yourself out there hitting golf balls. Record yourself playing notes. Because then you can go back and see that what your mind perception was and what the reality is maybe two different things. And in studying yourself, that can open up and give you a new perspective. Number 9, watch other people. If you can learn how to record and learn from your own practice sessions, you will have a better eye for watching how your competition operates as well. You'll be able to pick apart what they're doing and then steal their strategies. Well, I don't know if we want to steal their strategies, but we can be influenced by their strategies. This learning then becomes an inherent part of you and your process. Number 10, he says, always be growing. Always be looking for how you can improve and be focusing on your weaknesses, not your strengths. Always be searching for new competition. It's a journey. And on you to stay moving towards a consistent pace. So that was contributed by Nicholas Cole. He's got some good ideas here about things we should be thinking about when it comes time to practicing. I mean, how many of those things do you do? Do you sit down and, well, number 1, do you practice at all? If there's something you're trying to get good at, are you putting the time in? And if you're not putting the time in, I mean, that's the first challenge. I think as he talks about all these strategies and what you should be doing for practicing, something that I mentioned a little bit earlier that I think is absolutely critical is, are you passionate about this thing that you're doing? Because if you're not passionate about it and you don't have an interest or a desire or there's some sort of outcome, then none of this is going to make any sense to you. You're not going to be able to schedule the time. You're not going to be able to study yourself. You're not going to be able to watch other people because you are not interested in it. So I think that's one of the other fundamental takeaways as we go through this, is really finding something that you're passionate about. And in some cases, you don't have to be passionate about a specific topic. But what you have to see is you have to see that the end result is going to be greater than what you had to put into it. And if you can see a benefit out of it that's going to help you in some way, it might make all of that practicing worthwhile. You're listening to My Strategy. I'm your host, John M. Hawkins, coming to you live from the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. When we come back, we're going to talk about the problem with perfect practice. We'll be right back. Hello and welcome back, everyone. I'm John M. Hawkins. We're coming to you live from the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. The show is called My Strategy. Right before the break, we were talking about perfect practice and some of the fundamentals that people do not understand about practice. Now, we'd love to get your thoughts, so our studio number's open at 866-451-1451. You can give us a call later in the show to 866-451-1451. Also, send an email to talk@johnmhawkins.com, and you can send that email at any time. It's talk@johnmhawkins.com, and you can be entered into our weekly giveaway. All right, in this segment, we're going to be talking a little bit about the problem with perfect practice. This article is by Noah Kajiyama, and we learned a little bit about him and what he did with regard to practicing as he was going through Juilliard, and he wrote another article talking about the problem with perfect practice. He says, we all know that practice doesn't make perfect. Perfect practice does. And while we're on the subject, we might to admit to ourselves that 100% flawlessness is impossible, and that most of us do not have what it takes to be a true perfectionist anyway. Well, that's a bit of a sobering reality. We don't all have what it takes, so why would we try? So he says, that leaves us with the phrase often used in place of the classic practice makes perfect. Namely, practice does not make perfect. Only perfect practice makes perfect, which he says is often credited to legendary football coach Vince Lombardi. The thing is, that phrase, perfect practice, too often seems to give people the wrong impression. He says, how so? He says, perfect practice. It's easy to interpret the word perfect in this context to mean that we should avoid errors and mistakes in the practice room. After all, it stands to reason that if we are in the habit of making mistakes in the practice room, we're likely to make mistakes on stage too. Is that right? He says, okay, well, avoiding mistakes in the practice room would necessitate practicing very carefully and methodically, which isn't all bad. But it might also mean playing things slowly and working up to speed gradually. Again, he says, not always being such a bad thing. Though there might also be something to be said for getting the tempo up first and working on accuracy second on the same occasions. So he says, when perfect practice is bad, he says, but then there are times when this no mistakes allowed definition of perfect practice makes us afraid to try new things, something that might help us take our playing to the next level or in the long term, but make us sound worse in the short term. This is an interesting perspective here. How many times are we so afraid to make a mistake that we slow things down, that we're doing things deliberately? But in doing so, Noah suggests that that might actually be making us less good. Or times, he says, when we're afraid to stretch ourselves, reluctant to explore the edges of our current technical ability to see what cool things we might be capable of, unwilling to take some risks and go for broke in such a way that might lead us to fall on our face, but could also produce something very compelling to listen to. Far too many students that he's spoken to are afraid to experiment and risk sounding bad even in the practice room, fearing the judgment of students who may be bypassing or eavesdropping. He says, and then there are times when it manifests in avoidance, such as spending disproportionate amounts of time on working things you already do well at the expense of skills or passages that are comparatively weak. Noah says he's a big believer in cultivating and maximizing our strengths rather than spending all of our energy shoring up our weaknesses. This is a direct contrast to what we learned in the prior segment. But we mustn't neglect and avoid our weaknesses to protect our ego either. So only stunt our growth as musicians, artists, and people in the long run and limiting our abilities. He says, so what does perfect practice really mean? He says he's going to argue that perfect practice is just another name for what he calls deliberate practice. Mistakes aren't the problems. The problem is not taking the time to articulate the specifics of the mistake, the cause of the mistake, and the potential solutions so you can avoid making that same mistake over and over again. He says, take action. Don't worry. You don't have to be afraid of making mistakes in the practice room. Feel free to practice going for broke, work on things you struggle with, try new ways of doing things, experiment freely. Don't be afraid to sound like crap as long as you know why. I think this is a great concept here. You aren't always going to be able to perform at the highest level. You aren't always going to do things perfectly. But if you have the ability to know when you're not doing things perfectly, and if you have a recording or a way for you to go back and look at that imperfection, it might give you some insight. And so when you're in that situation again, you will know how to handle it better. And that doesn't mean that you're practicing, you make one mistake and you stop. No, keep going. Continue to experiment. Continue to develop what you are working on, even if it doesn't sound good. He says, tired of sounding bad and need an ego boost? No problem. Go ahead and start a practice session by playing something you play well and feel good about. Just don't let yourself get stuck on working on this at the expense of neglecting weaker areas of your repertoire or skill set. I think it's interesting what he's got here. You know, here's somebody who spent 3 to 4 hours a day practicing for 23 years to become an expert in what he does. And he has gone through the actions, the 10,000 plus hours to become perfect, not perfect, but to become the best that he can be at his skill, at his trade, at what he does. So the question now is, what is it that do we need to be focusing on from our own skills perspective? What is my strategy? What are the things that I want to start growing and I want to start developing? And when we figure that out, then we have the ability to take all the lessons learned about the perfect practice, about the mindfulness, about going out there and trying to figure out exactly how to become better at what we do. And I think that's part of the goal of this whole show, really to figure out how we can improve. The only way to do that is through practice or perfect practice. You're listening to My Strategy. I'm your host, John M. Hawkins, coming to you live from the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. When we come back, we're going to talk about tips to help you practice more effectively. We'll be right back. Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm John M. Hawkins. The show is My Strategy. We're coming to you live from the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. If you're just joining us, welcome to the show. Today we're talking about practice makes perfect. In this episode, we're talking about how to approach practicing, how often you should practice. Practice makes perfect, and we're learning tips and tricks to help maximize your practice time. Our shows are live on Saturdays at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. So if you're interested, you can go out and find past podcast recordings on the internet, or you can find the video of these shows, many of them on YouTube. So right before the break, we were talking about the problem with perfect practice. In this segment, I want to talk a little bit about tips we can use to help maximize our practice time. Got an article here by Amy McKenzie, and she's come up with some ways that you can practice more effectively. She says, incorporate these tips into your daily practice routine, and you'll soon see the benefits. I guess it's that simple, Amy. Number one, she says, create an atmosphere. Get the right setup for you, whether you prefer to concentrate in a quiet room or somewhere with more stimulation. Try to be consistent with your choice. This will help you enter the right mindset when you begin to practice. Make sure you have everything you need close by. Water, snacks, pencils, sharpeners, highlighters, manuscripts, etc. I think that's a good idea. Have a specific environment that supports what you're trying to do. I think many times people do not think about it that way, and they try and make do with what they can where they are. But if it's not conducive or there's distractions, you aren't going to be able to concentrate and focus on what you need to do. Number two, she says, warm up. Like a physical workout, a warm-up is essential. But don't just plow through the same warm-up routine every time and let your mind wander. A warm-up isn't just about getting your muscles moving. Take it as an opportunity to prepare your body and mind for work and take stock of how you're feeling, how you're breathing, the tension in your body is holding, and why you are doing that particular exercise or activity. She says your warm-up doesn't have to be 15 minutes of scales. Try different technical studies or sight reading. If you are going to do scales, consider the keys of the pieces you are rehearsing, as well as a cool down. Revisit a piece of music you already know well and enjoy. Number three, Amy says, have a goal. Playing through all your old music isn't the same as practicing. Start with the end in mind. By having a goal for each practice session before you start playing, you will find the progress much more quickly and effectively. Then break each goal down into smaller focus objectives. You'll feel a greater sense of accomplishment as you complete each goal. You know, I think about all the discipline it takes to become a great musician and the process they are going through. And, you know, as we go through these, I can't help but think, you know, what if you were to go after every goal in your life this way, or pick a few goals to focus on, and you were this methodical about it, that you got up at the same time every day, that you had the right environment, that you set a goal before each practice session. I mean, I can just imagine that putting together some sort of a strategy or a game plan around whatever activity you're focusing on really is going to help you become successful. It's going to help you get farther ahead than those peers who are doing that mindless practicing. Amy says we need to be realistic. We all grew up with our teachers telling us, don't leave it till the night before. We've all been guilty of at some point doing that, and we have an intimidating part to practice. It's easy to push it to the back of our minds. However, it's much more effective to practice little and often and slowly chip away at your nemesis day by day. Makes sense. Chunk it up. Do a little bit every day. Identify and overcome the problem. She says, don't just play a piece or passage over and over and over and over again. Definitely just don't power through a problem area and ignore it. Identify where you're stumbling on or out, and continuously using the wrong fingering, work it out while it's going wrong. Then decide how you are going to fix it. I think that's good advice. How many times do you run into a problem and instead of really focusing and solving the problem and understanding why it is, you just kind of go through it as quickly as you can. Oh, that was good enough. Let me move on to the next one. The challenge is that if you don't fix it then, if you don't identify why you're doing it, if you don't go through and perfect it at some point, it's always going to sound kind of like a mumble, like a muddle through, and you're not going to be able to do it. So really, if there is something strategically that you need to be working on, a course of actions, something that is going to help you get to that end result, don't muddle through it. It is important to address it. Number 6, she says, being a musician is so much more than just playing the notes. She says it's also important to understand your instrument, your repertoire, the history of the period, and why the music is written in a certain way. For example, if you're singing in a foreign language, make sure you translate the libretto so you understand the true meaning behind the words. Spend your time listening to great artists and recordings of the music you are playing, and try to analyze what makes the artist or particular performance so great. She says visualize yourself playing. That can also be extremely helpful. Number 7, write on your music. Don't be afraid to scribble on your scores. Obviously, some music does have to be treasured, but photocopy your score and do whatever it takes to make it easier to interpret the music. If you're missing something once, make a mental note. But if it's a common occurrence, then don't be afraid to write it in the correct fingering. Highlight the dynamics or remind yourself of a key challenge. Again, she says we should record ourselves. We've heard that before today. Be in the right frame of mind. She says we're all human. Sometimes we're just simply not in the mood to practice. There's no point in practicing and creating new mistakes rather than overcoming them. So unless you are under a huge amount of pressure, it's okay to take a day off or simply keep your fingers moving by spending 10 to 20 minutes playing something you know well and really enjoy. Ultimately, we all play because we enjoy the feeling and sound of our instruments, and it can be easy to get frustrated with the pressure, and we forget to have fun. Finally, Amy says you should reward yourself. At the end of each practice session, remind yourself how amazing you are to be playing an instrument and treat yourself afterwards. You're listening to My Strategy. I am your host, John M. Hawkins. We're coming to you live from the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. When we come back, we're going to talk about ways to develop your practice strategy. We'll be right back. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the show. The show is My Strategy. I'm John M. Hawkins, and we're coming to you live on the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. If you're just joining us, very happy you could be here with us today. Right before the break, we were talking about tips to help you practice more effectively. Went through 10 different tips, which I thought many of them were pretty good. A couple thoughts here. One, you got a few more minutes to get your emails into the show. Send something to talk@johnmhawkins.com. Send an email, something, to talk@johnmhawkins.com. If you send an email, you'll be entered into our weekly giveaway. That's a $25 Visa gift card, copy of my latest book, Coach to Greatness, and the satisfaction of knowing that you won something. If you won it, give it a shot. All right, so we're talking in this segment about developing your strategy. And I have a specific approach or a process that I use to go through developing strategies. Developed this over years, and it's really a 5-step process. Number one, it's the awareness. What are the visions, the goals? What is it that you're trying to achieve? And this works with anything you're trying to do. You could be a business trying to accomplish a goal. You could be a musician, like many of the examples today where you're trying to learn how to become a master at what you do. You might want to become an expert, a better parent, a better grandparent, whatever it is in life. We all have to be aware of why we want to do this. Build the vision, identify those goals. The next step is really to assess and analyze the situation. And when we assess and analyze a situation, it means that we get intelligence behind why we are doing certain things. So from an assessment and analysis perspective, if we are trying to play guitar, we're trying to play piano or violin, and we're not doing as well, why are we not doing as well? Have we recorded ourselves? Have we talked to a coach? What is it that we are doing that is not gaining those results that we want to get? And only in doing the analysis are you going to be able to come up with metrics to determine what are the next steps. So once you've identified, where you need to be focusing on your time on it, strategize and plan. What are the course of actions that you've been taking? Have you been doing mindless practice? Have you been saving all your practice for once a week, just on Saturdays, and you spend 12 hours practicing? That's a strategy. It's a course of action. According to what we've learned today with all these different articles and tips and tricks, that might not be the best plan. So from a strategy and planning perspective, we want to be looking at those courses of actions. If we're practicing, what is the environment that we're practicing in? Who's helping us with the practice? Are we giving ourselves time to warm up? Are we giving ourselves time to really focus and be mindful in the practice, deliberate practice, perfect practice, or are we not? Are we, having technical interruptions through our iPhones and our iDevices and things like that? Are there other people in the room? All those things impact how we are going to go about accomplishing this goal. So once we've got our course of actions identified, we know there's going to be some shifts. And if you're looking at being better at whatever it is that you want to be better at, you have to actively change the course of actions. You have to implement this new plan. You have to determine that what was working or what wasn't working is not working. And if you continue to work on that, it is going to get you no closer to the goal that you've set. So it means that we do have to implement our plan. It means that we have to, try some of those things that might be scary. As Noah said in the first segment on the show, that, you might not want to try something new if you're in a studio because you would be fear of not doing it right and somebody could ridicule you. So let's get through that. Let's figure out what the plan is. Let's figure out how we are going to then go about implementing it and testing it in different areas. And finally, it comes down to really support and evaluation. If the plan's not working, why is it not working? And if it's not working, then we need to find help. It's either getting someone who's a professional to help you. It's finding a peer group, a group to work with, a mentor, somebody who can help you. So from that perspective, as you're building your strategy, and we're talking about practice, I thought it would be interesting here to go through some of the tips that Noah has given to help us accelerate at our skill development. So as you're thinking about your strategy, he says he's got 5 different principles that he wants to share with a younger version of himself. He says, number 1, focus is everything. Keep practice sessions limited to a duration that allows you to stay focused. Now, this is interesting. It's not 3 to 4 hours. He says it could be as short as 10 to 20 minutes or as long as 45 to 60 minutes. Once you lose your focus, move on. Okay? Number 2, timing is everything. Keep track of the times during the day when you tend to have the most energy. This may be the first thing in the morning or right before lunch, and try to do your practicing during these naturally productive periods. Good advice. Number 3, don't trust your memory. Use a practice notebook. Plan out your practice and keep track of your practice goals. And as you discover during your practice session, get those written down. The key to getting into a flow and practicing is to consistently strive for clarity of intention. Have a crystal clear idea of what you want, the sound you want to produce, or particular phrasing you'd like to try, or specific articulation, intonation, etc., and that you'd like to be able to execute consistently. Number 4, he says, work smarter and not harder. When things aren't working, sometimes we simply have to practice more, and then there's times when it means we have to go in a different direction. He remembers struggling with the left hand pizzicato variation in Pangini's 24th Caprice when he was studying at Juilliard, and he kept trying harder and harder to make the note speak. But all he got was sore fingers, a couple of which actually started to bleed. Number 5, stay on target with a problem-solving model. It's extraordinarily easy to drift into mindless practice. Keep yourself on task using the 6-step problem-solving model below, and he talks about defining, analyzing, identifying potential solutions, test those solutions, implement the best solutions, and monitor implementation. Sounds like he's got some tips, too, for goal setting and building a strategy. Anyway, I thought those would be helpful as you are thinking about your own practice methodology and what it is that you want to be focusing on. I think that as we've gone through Noah's examples and some of the other examples, there really isn't just one size fits all for figuring out the best way to practice. And really it comes down to maybe what is working and how do we measure and make sure that the practice we are putting in is giving us a performance increase. You're listening to My Strategy. I'm your host, John M. Hawkins, coming to you live from the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. When we come back, we're going to talk about putting your plan in place. We'll be right back. Hello and welcome back, everyone. I'm John Hawkins, your host of My Strategy. We're coming to you live from the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. Well, happy to be here with you today and really glad you could join us. My Strategy episodes are live and on Saturdays at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. And in case you've missed this broadcast, you can go listen on iHeartRadio, Apple iTunes, or if you'd like to have something covered on the show, send an email to talk@johnmhawkins.com. Or you can give me a call at 1-844-MY-STRATEGY. So email, talk@johnmhawkins.com or 1-844-MY-STRATEGY. And if you get your email in within the next 8 or so minutes, you'll be entered into the weekly giveaway where you get a chance to win a $25 Visa gift card and a copy of my latest book. All right, so today we've been talking about practice makes perfect. We've been talking about how to approach practicing, how we should practice. Perfect practice makes perfect. Learning tips and tricks to help maximize our practice time. So practice makes perfect. What are you trying to get good at? We learned today from a performer who went to Juilliard. His name is Noah. And he had spent over 23 years perfecting his art of being able to play an instrument. And he gave us some tips about what performers say. What do psychiatrists say? And some of the ruts that we run into, such as mindless practice. And he said that whatever happens, it's very important for us to not fall into that mindless practice because it doesn't do us any good. It can discourage us. We can become less confident. And as a result of that, we are not going to get better at what it is we are trying to do. We then transitioned and talked a little bit about the fundamental things that people don't understand about practice. That practice actually is an art, and there is a science behind practicing as well. And it's not just about practicing for the sake of practicing, but it really is about mindful practice. It's about setting goals and objectives. It's about setting time limits. It's about being in the right state of mind. It's about having a plan and a strategy, which is a course of actions so that you practice properly. So those fundamental things that we need to be thinking about with regard to accomplishing goals and what we talk about weekly on this show all apply to practice and being able to practice. We then talked a little bit about how there might be a problem with perfect practice. And while perfect practice might sound like a good way to practice, we learned from Noah that perfect practice can sometimes be bad. That there are risks associated when we try and be too perfect. That sometimes we need to redefine our definition of perfect practice. And when you practice, it is not about being to slow down and be absolutely perfect and methodical with every single note, with every single action, with every single step. Because there are times when you are going to have to focus on a specific area. And if you are not able to do that, complete that area, or you're not able to go out there and be good in that specific area, you have to stop, record yourself, get help from a coach, somebody who can take a look at what you're doing and help you work through it. So that's why he says perfect practice is not always the best. And we need to find a way to incorporate risks into what we're doing. We then went through some tips to help us practice more effectively, such as creating an atmosphere, warming up, having a goal, being realistic, and overcoming problems. And I think that all of this comes down to a conscious prioritization of our habits, and then finding a way to break them and introduce new ones that are going to help us achieve our goal and objectives. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Appreciate you being with us. You're listening to My Strategy. I am your host, John M. Hawkins. We're on the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio, and we'll see you next time. Have a good day.